Okay, I think we should probably start. Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Louise Michel Sports Club's launch event. Thank you for tuning in, particularly in these unprecedented times. It's great to have a way to bring these events to you virtually, and we hope that one day soon we'll get to actually meet face to face and do this in real life. So I'm going to kick off with some introductions. First of all, introduce myself. My name is Bahar. I'm one of the founding members of the Louise Michel Sports Club and the welfare officer of the club. I've previously been involved in anti-fascism and the wider workers' movement, as well as student activism, migrant rights struggles, and women's liberation, and so on. This evening, we're fortunate enough to have some great speakers who will be able to provide some background as to the ethos of our sports club. Sadly, Gabriel Kuhn, who was due to speak this evening, isn't able to join us, but he will give a talk in the future. So first, we're going to hear from Neil Gordon-Orr, who is a keen runner and the welfare officer for Kent Athletics Club based in Ladywell. Neil will be talking about the history of South East London's radical scenes and sports clubs and give a bit of insight into Louise Michel's South East London addresses. And then we're going to hear from Dr. Constance Bantman, senior lecturer in French at the University of Surrey, whose research includes the history of the French anarchist movement before 1914, and in particular the anarchists exiled in London during this period, including Louise Michel. Constance will be talking about nature and sport in anarchist education, Louise Michel's London connection, and a bit about Louise Michel herself. So thank you both for joining us. I'm just going to before we get started, I'll just give a quick background about the Louise Michel Sports Club. So we're a radical sports club for people living, for people involved in the workers' movement. We train together, support each other, and want to encourage others to join an active lifestyle. Our focus at the moment is on running, self-defense, and hiking. But as we grow, we hope to organize a range of club events. If you want to get involved, we'll provide some details in the call, or you can visit www.louisemichel.club. I'm going to hand over to Neil. And at the end of the call, I'm going to read out the winners of the virtual race that that took place earlier today. So Neil, if you want to kick off.
Yeah, okay. I'm interested in the history of South East London. I've written a bit about it, and I'm also a keen runner. And what I'm going to do tonight is just try and bring together a few local history threads, particularly from South East London, that might be relevant to the Louise Michel Sports Club. And I think there's obviously many different ways we could approach that, many different places we could talk about. But I'm going to focus really on one in particular, primarily around the Peckham Rye area. I went for a run over Peckham Rye earlier on. Obviously, there was no park run on today, no hundreds of people all heading off together, but there was a lot of people out exercising and taking advantage of the fresh air, as they have been doing there for hundreds of years, as Peckham Rye Common before it was even a park. So the first thread I'm going to talk about is really briefly about Louise Michel. Obviously, Constance is going to talk a bit more about her afterwards, but she lived not far from Peckham Rye during the 1890s when she was living in exile for much of that time in London. And I did some research a while ago trying to find out exactly where she lived, and did manage to do that. So she lived actually for some years in what was at the time called Placket Road in East Dulwich. That's up by East Dulwich Station. It's now the Dulwich end of Copston Road. The name's changed, but she lived there for some time. She also lived in Chesterfield Grove, which is off Lordship Lane. And she lived in 1900, she moved to Forest Hill or Sydenham. She lived at a place called Albion Villas Road. That people might not know, but there's a nice little park right next to the house, which is still standing, called Millennium Green. So I'm going to pull up a few photos now for the rest of the talk. So bear with me a second while I get that going. So that's Albion Villas. That's the still standing house where Louise Michel lived in 1900. Actually, at the time, it was the home of someone called Auguste Vauvel, who was the father of Charlotte Vauvel, who was Louise Michel's sort of long-term companion and nurse and friend. They lived together for most of the time during this period. So while she was living in London, Louise Michel was asked to speak at various meetings. Often she spoke at meetings which were kind of commemoration events, or including for the Chicago martyrs who were executed following the May Day demonstrations and the massacre as it became known a few years earlier. So this poster here is from 1893, advertising a meeting in London to commemorate the Chicago martyrs. And as well as Kropotkin and others, Louise Michel is scheduled to talk. I don't believe she actually did talk at this meeting though, because there is a report of it in Freedom, and she's not mentioned in the report. And also Kropotkin didn't turn up either, he sent a letter. But what I found interesting about looking down this is underneath it, there's a mention of there being a local Chicago Martyrs commemorative meeting held by the Peckham anarchists at the Peckham and Dulwich Radical Club. So the Peckham and Dulwich Radical Club was, as it says there, at 188 Rye Lane, and that building still stands too. That is what is now Canavan's Pool Hall at the Rye end of Rye Lane. And it was a significant venue for London radicalism in various kinds at that time, as well as the anarchist meeting there, the Social Democratic Federation, who were the kind of more Marxist organisation. They held their local meetings there. A lot of luminaries from that time spoke there. William Morris spoke there. Annie Besant, who was a leading radical who then became very involved in theosophy and the campaign for Indian independence. She gave a number of talks about theosophy there in the 1890s as well. And it was kind of a social centre in a way as well as a meeting place. They had their own band. They had big entertainments and so on. And here's a poster for a monster entertainment at the Peckham Dulwich Radical Club. This was organised by the Social Democratic Federation, and included a play and music and so on. But it was also very linked in with Peckham Rye, because that building overlooks the northernmost corner of the Rye, which was known at that time as the Triangle. Some people still call it that now. And most of the groups who met inside that building also had public open air meetings outside that included the SDF and the anarchists. We know that in 1888 was the famous London Match Girls strike. There was a meeting of several thousand people on Peckham Rye. And afterwards, the press report says that the strikers went back to the Radical Club on Rye Lane, where they were supplied with bread, cheese and coffee. Also, during that period, the Radical Club set out something called the Peckham Rye Commons Defence League, which was to defend the right to have public meetings on Peckham Rye, which at that point were under threat. So I'm not sure quite how much interaction Louise Michel, who was living just up the road, had with that particular scene at the time around the Radical Club, but we know there was some overlap. At the May Day demonstration in 1894 in Hyde Park, which was called by the SDF, there was an anarchist platform from which Louise Michel spoke, and the press reports do say that the International Anarchist Communist Group of Peckham were there with a big banner which read, "Away with authority and monopoly, we demand free access to the means of life." So that area of Peckham Rye and the Radical Club opposite were very important. And actually, even after the Radical Club declined, there was still lots of interesting political history around Peckham Rye, which I haven't really got time to go into now. But for instance, in 1937, Oswald Mosley spoke there, the British Union of Fascists, and the meeting was disrupted by anti-fascists. And one of the first women's liberation groups, the Peckham Group, in 1970, used to meet at Peckham Rye in the playroom there. And they were one of the groups that set up the first National Women's Liberation Conference in 1970. And they were also the ones who came up with the idea to disrupt the 1970 Miss World. They were actually mentioned on the recent TV documentary on it. So there's a whole kind of interesting radical history around Peckham Rye, to cut a long story short. But there's also a sporting history as well. And the area was a key focus for the development of organised athletics in England in the second half of the 19th century, when the period when the first running clubs were formed, for instance. And there were two clubs who became very important in athletics, were both formed in Peckham Rye. One was the Peckham Hare and Hounds, who were formed in 1869. They were formed in a meeting at what was called the King's Arms. The pub's no longer there, but it's on the corner overlooking the Rye as you go down towards East Dulwich. It's now flats. It was known for a while as King's on the Rye. Anyway, that was one of the first three athletics clubs to be formed in the UK, and they later moved up to Blackheath, became known as the Blackheath Harriers. They're now the successor clubs called the Blackheath and Bromley Harriers. Very important club. For instance, Dina Asher-Smith, who is the fastest ever English women's runner, she's a member of that club. And that all started out in Peckham Rye, as did a couple of years later the South London Harriers, also formed up Peckham Rye in 1871. They also moved out. I think what tended to happen was, as the area became more urbanised, these clubs who were very much based around cross-country running, the space to do that was gradually being narrowed down by building work. So these clubs tended to move further out to the suburbs to more suitable cross-country terrain. But in the 1890s, the same time we're talking about the Radical Club and Louise Michel, the Peckham Harriers were still having their runs. They were based at that point at the Rye Hotel, which is still there. And there's a report, for instance, from 1891 of one of their races, which consisted of running from Peckham Rye up to Crystal Palace and back via Dulwich Park and Barry Road. So a familiar route to many runners today. The picture there, by the way, I put in, it's from that time. It's an advert for some kind of running or some kind of lotion that you put on yourself when you're injured, and it's got a quote in it from the Peckham Harriers Honorary Secretary H.G. Burden, recommending it for sprains and stiffness. This ointment that was popular with runners. So in the late 19th century, we've got this ferment of sporting and political energies all around Peckham Rye, and Louise Michel living just up the road. So I'm just talk briefly now about some of the ways in which those things came together, with the beginning of a radical sports movement in the 1890s. And the key starting point for that was the formation of the Clarion Cycling Club in 1895. The Clarion was a kind of socialist newspaper, but there was a whole scene developed around it, a whole social movement. And one of the things they did was set up a socialist cycling club in 1895, with the mission being to propagate socialism fellowship. And got quite a cool letterhead there, which was designed by Walter Crane, who did some famous imagery. It's kind of got, it looks to me like it's got an angel blowing with the kind of bike wheel underneath the trumpet, but I'm not too sure. But this is a national movement. There were groups all over the country, but there were certainly some in the Peckham area. The HQ of what was known as the Camberwell branch of the Clarion Cycling Club was in Queen's Road, Peckham. They also had a rambling club. In the lead up to the First World War, there was a mixed swimming club, Clarion Swimming Club, which met at Camberwell Baths. And they continued after the First World War too. This is an advert for a Camberwell Clarion Cycling Club Carnival and Dance being held in Peckham Road in 1920. So that was a very important thing that kind of brought together these two strands of radical movements and sports. In about 19, when was it? I'm just going to check my date here. Yes, the Clarion went on to become part of the establishment of the British Workers' Sports Federation, which was set up in the 1920s. That was kind of an internationalist kind of effort. There was a big focus on international friendship through sports, really. Their slogans included peace through sports, footballs, not cannonballs, freedom of sport, freedom of thought. This is the Stepney Workers' Sports Club banner. They had many different groups all over the country. There were splits in it between the Communist Party and people associated with the Labour Party and the Independent Labour Party, and the latter eventually split away to start something else called the National Workers' Sports Association in 1930. But you had a whole load of different kind of workers' sports club of one kind or another all around the country. There was the British Workers' Sports Federation Football League. They played Hackney Marshes and elsewhere. There was a netball league, there was a Red Wheelers cycling club, and so on. And there was a lot of rambling involved, which obviously people will be familiar with the campaign for free access to Kinder Scout and other places in that period. So locally, there was a group, I come across one in Lewisham called the Krasny Sports Club. That's Krazny. They had a swimming team, they swam at Ladywell Baths, they had rambling, they had a netball team that played on hilly fields. And there was also a bit of an overlap with the Workers' Theatre movement, which was a kind of, as the name suggests, a radical theatre group. It's all part of trying to build up this kind of independent working class culture. So I've got a little example here from 1939 of an event that was taking place in Rye Lane, Peckham. It was a benefit for AIDS Spain Committee. This is during the Spanish Civil War. And it involved the dramatic section of the Building Trade Workers Sport Association. And they were putting on a play of a version of the Ragged Trouser Philanthropists. And if people know that story, basically it's kind of all explaining the sort of Marxist theory of value and exploitation through a group of building workers. And this was actually put on by a group of building workers. And the story from the Daily Herald describes the guy who's laying the bricks, rehearsing his lines to take part in the Ragged Trouser Philanthropists. And that was all coming out, as I say, from one of the Workers' Sports Association. Just coming towards an end. There were some quite big events. This was in 1937, organised by the Daily Worker, the paper of the Communist Party. This was at Abbey Wood, further out in southeast London. They had a similar event at Herne Hill around this time in the Velodrome. We can see from this event the kind of things they were putting on. There's boxing, weightlifting, races, and so on. Also, interestingly, in there is a mention of a jiu-jitsu performance. This came from a couple of people associated with something called the Prolet Club, Prolet. The Prolet Club was based in Stratford and was a workers' sports group that had an emphasis on fitness and self-defense. And they went around doing exhibitions in various places, including here. So, but obviously there's some issues there. I won't go into too much into this now, but obviously this was the height of Stalinism, a kind of top-down model, obviously from the Communist Party leadership. But within the workers' sports movement, I think there was some tension there. It was often driven locally by people who were not necessarily too bothered about the constantly changing lines of the leadership at that point. A lot of people actually in the leadership of the Communist Party were quite hostile to sports. They were kind of forced to take notice of it by the rank and file members. And these formal events were really just the tip of the iceberg of a much wider culture in which the trade unions, labour movement and sports overlapped. So the final example I'll give to finish comes from 1937. There was a major bus strike in London. It started on the 1st of May 1937, so this time of year. And they were demanding a half-an-hour reduction in their 8-hour working week. And during the strike, the bus workers from the garages locally, which were included the Old Kent Road and one on Nunhead Lane, they organised their own cricket matches on Peckham Rye. That's reported in the Daily Worker at the time. So that's coming to a close, really, because we're back now on Peckham Rye on May Day, or near enough, as we are now. So I think that'll do for now. It's a very rocket-fueled overview of South London radical sports, but I think it's something that I'm interested in doing more research on. And I think there's a whole lot more to find out about that. Thank you.
Amazing, thank you so much. That was really fascinating, actually. I'm going to invite Constance to speak now, and I'll mute myself.
Brilliant. Well, first of all, good evening, everyone. First of all, I'd like to congratulate all club members on launching the club tonight. It's such a great initiative, and it's so great to be able to do this, even with the challenge of the lockdown. So brilliant. And congratulations to all the runners who completed the races today. I followed some of your achievements online. I did a walk in support. So yes, congratulations, everyone. So I'll focus on Michel here, and especially her time in London. So Louise Michel, as I'm sure most of you will know, was a lifelong social revolutionary, feminist and educator. an absolutely incredible, highly prolific figure, and she is the perfect figurehead, I think, for the club, and I'll try and explain why. First, through brief biographical overview, Michel had a long, really busy and diverse life. She was an incredibly creative person, and yes, it would take quite a long time to go through everything, especially because there were so many periods in her life and different stages. So she was born in 1830 and the illegitimate daughter of a chateau owner, presumably, and the maid of the chateau. She was brought up by her paternal grandparents on the chateau side, who gave her a good education, financial support. Her biographers reckon that there was always a sense of alienation, of falling in between classes as part of her upbringing. And clearly, from a very young age, she displayed a very keen sense of social solidarity, a keen eye for social injustice, and a strong desire to act on it. She was also a born educator, clearly very culturally voracious, avid reader, and from her youth, she read eagerly and she formed friendships with many prominent writers as she got older. She trained as a primary school teacher, so she was qualified by the mid-50s, I believe. But she didn't get to work really in the state system because she wouldn't pledge allegiance to Napoleon III, as was required at the time. France was under the Second Empire. So she set up a series, a group of individual schools, free schools, independent schools, which were especially addressed to the children of poor workers. And very quickly, she developed a special interest in girls' education, and that was a lifelong strand of her life. And then towards the late 60s, early 70s, we find her in the Paris area teaching, very well connected in social revolutionary circles. She was a Blanquist at the time, so that was an insurrectional revolutionary strand of socialism. And soon what happened, of course, was I'll produce an illustration now. The sorry, let me share this. The siege of Paris and the Paris Commune, of course, which is really the moment where the great legend of Louise Michel began. So we have here a sort of famous portrait of Michel, and on the right, an illustration of Michel during the Commune as this icon of the Commune in the graphic novel by Tardy, which dates back to the early noughties and is an incredible graphic novel about the Paris Commune. So this revolution stroke insurrection, which redefined socialism at the time, and in which Michel was incredibly prominent. So still working as a teacher, but also as a National Guard for the military defense of the Commune, as a fighter of the Commune, of course, working for the ambulance service, distributing charity meals to children as well, and running her own radical club. All of this, as I've mentioned, she was a really creative and active individual, and it stayed with her throughout. So when the Commune fell, Michel, of course, had been heavily involved. She was really prominent, and there was also a lot of attention towards these revolutionary women known as pétroleuses, the fireheads, if you like. So she was a prime target. She spent 2 years in prison and then was sent in deportation to the penal colony of New Caledonia. So she stayed in New Caledonia for 7 years, from 1873 to 1880. She went there with a group of other prominent communards who were deported, and especially her friend Henri Rochefort, very contentious figure, but who was a lifelong support for Michel. And once she was there, she put her time to good use, as usual. She wrote extensively. She was, but she also befriended the local Kanak population, and she acquainted herself with their literary musical customs, which she later wrote about. She wrote a history of the Commune, And later on, towards the end of her stint in New Caledonia, she was allowed to teach Kanak children 1 or 2 days a week, which she did. And this is regarded as a moment where she developed her educational principles to adapt them to her new pupils. She also, and surprisingly, when the Kanak rebelled, supported the Kanak uprising. And then an amnesty came and Michel came back to Paris. By that time, she was an absolute icon in the French socialist movement. And this is when she became an anarchist. He says she switched over on her way back, on the boat on the way back. This was when she had a revelation. And so she is really an important figure in the early development of the French anarchist movement, which was growing in prominence at the time. And Michel was actually leading a demonstration in 1883 where the anarchist black flag was waved for the first time. There was a bit of looting, so Michel ended up in jail, but this is regarded really as such a milestone for the movement, and it's quite unsurprising that Michel was there prominently as well. So throughout the 80s, we see her as the arch revolutionary, writing away, as usual, but across a very wide range of genres. This is quite striking. She writes drama, poetry, near scientific writing, a little bit obscure, political, historical writing. So that's the usual activities. Great orator, of course. Neil showed us some of the images from London. She was already extremely active in France. She was a very sought after speaker, I believe quite a lucrative one for the movement. That was an effective way of fundraising. And also she was quite an active personality in the sense that she remained a revolutionary at the time when terrorist currents were developing within the movement known as propaganda by the deed, the sort of terrorist undercurrent in the contemporary anarchist movement. Michel was quite the proponent, and she sort of embraced very fiery, very strong rhetoric, revolutionary rhetoric. So she also ended up doing some prison time, and the French government attempted to section her. She had quite a lot of influence, and this huge influence, this huge international following as well. And there was a real sense of threat associated with her because she was a woman. She could easily be portrayed as being hysteric. So they did section her for some time. She was also targeted by an assassination attempt, and in classic Michel fashion, she denied to press charges towards the young man who had tried to kill her. So after this very eventful decade, Michel relocated to London in the very early 1890s. She had just had enough with police surveillance in France. That was the reason she gave. And so she moved to London at the time where anarchists from all over Europe were flocking towards London, which was the one remaining liberal asylum left in Europe. So this great international anarchist hub. But one aspect in which Michel was an exception is the fact that she was such a keen Anglophile. Most of the French anarchists who went there at the time, maybe 400 or 500 of them, were just desperate to go back home. They hated England, but Michel absolutely loved England. So here we have her successive addresses. Neil has shown some evidence relating to this, and here we have just a few documents. I believe this is from the International Institute of Social History, where her correspondence is there. And so she lived first at the heart of what was known as La Petite France, the French sort of anarchist headquarter in London, and then gradually moved out. And French journalists would come and interview her there. She was still this great international celebrity of the anarchist movement. British journalists would interview her as well. And she declared her love for Britain. She would hop back to France for speaking tours. There would be crowds gathering on train platforms at the Gare Saint-Lazare to welcome her. So she was the celebrity, and she really used these platforms, of course, to preach, her revolutionary ideas, which she always did very effectively, always commanding these great crowds, but also to declare her love for the country. So she loved English literature. She loved Shelley, and I'm not sure which Shelley it was, but I think it might have been the poet or Mary Shelley, not quite sure. She had many friendships, many English, British friendships. So amidst revolutionary circles, although sometimes other revolutionary figures could be a little ungenerous towards Michel, this is documented elsewhere. But if you look at her archives, still in Amsterdam, there are invitations to speak at women's institutes, invitations from the sort of upper echelons of English society. So that's a more eccentric span, but she clearly made friends in her day-to-day life, in her evening classes, which apparently she took. She learned the language, or at least she declared her intention to learn English, which again was quite atypical. I am not sure she followed through with it, but she certainly announced it with quite a lot of fanfare during a public intervention. And above all, very surprisingly, of course, for an anarchist, she proclaimed her great love and admiration for the British political system, liberalism. But that was something that other anarchists shared, other exiles, and including her friend Charles Malato. The idea was that anarchist radicals had so much more freedom in the UK to express their ideas and to demonstrate, and that repression was far less intense. So this was a recurring argument, and she really embraced this celebration of the monarchy versus the French Republic, which seems quite crazy retrospectively, but at the time it made a lot of sense. Another institution which she seemed to celebrate a bit more surprisingly is actually the workhouse, which she saw as a sort of safety net for workers. So really a sort of deep thought through Anglophilia, which I think is the main reason why it is so great to have this club named after her. Michel was really involved in the politics of the exile colonies and wanted to create a refuge for international exiles. So she really saw herself being there in the long term in London. But she didn't get to do that. But what she did get to do was create the international school on Fitzroy Square. So, sorry, not Fitzroy Square, actually 19 Fitzroy Street, which of course nowadays is Ad Agency Central, but back in the day was the heartland of La Petite France. So we are back to Walter Crane, who designed the prospectus for the school with a Bakuninist motto, if you like. So from each according to his capacity, to each according to his needs, slightly again counterintuitively, liberty, equality, fraternity, which was the motto, and is still the motto of the French Republic, which Michel was no fan of, but sometimes in exile, some ideological adjustments happen. La solidarité humaine, human solidarity. And here, so, well, beautiful illustration. So this is a rare prospectus, as you can imagine. There's not that much documentary evidence relating to the school. The school existed for just 1 year. By the end of 1892, some bomb-making materials were discovered in the basement of the school, having been planted there by the secretary of the school, Auguste Coulon, who was an infiltrated spy. And the school closed down amidst a lot of jeers and anti-anarchist stereotyping on the part of journalists, the police. But this has really obscured the fact that it was such an interesting and modern, forward-looking educational experiment, which really projected Michel's views on education. It also reflected a great interest at the time within anarchist and socialist circles for education as a reformist and revolutionary and transformative institution. So the school was anarchist in its principles. They taught the Chicago martyrs' history in the history lessons. And in terms of subjects, all the subjects you could dream of course, languages with an internationalist of understanding music. Michel herself taught the piano, but from the perspective of the sports club, what is really interesting is that she embraced this idea, which was also known at the time as integral education, that had been formulated by the French pedagogue Paul Robin, and is also found later in the ideas of rational education, the modern school movement, organized by Ferrer. And the idea was really to do away with the dichotomy between body and mind, and to really celebrate physical education. So of course, physical education was on the curriculum, as was technical education. And this idea that there is a hierarchy with intellectual subjects holding pride of place was really rejected within this whole movement. And I think from there, we can extend it towards ideas of fitness, of course, well-being, and also moving towards a celebration of nature, which I think goes in the direction of what Neil has discussed, really, the outdoors excursions, sports, all of this, of course, within the context of solidarity practices. So to wrap it up, when Michel died, but even later, she was really integrated into the French Republican landscape. The French Republic established itself by celebrating many historical figures who had been instrumental in the advent of the French Republic, which was established for good in the 1870s. And nowadays, there are many Louise Michel schools in France and in New Caledonia as well. So you have an example here, primary school Louise Michel. There is, of course, a metro station in the northeast of Paris, close to where she lived. There you have the Place Louise Michel in Marseille, south of France, where she died in 1905. And right there, so this is Montmartre and the Sacré-Cœur, where much of the commune action unfolded and, well, was resolved tragically. Right here, in front of the Sacré-Cœur, is the Square Louise Michel. Now, Michel and the anarchists hated the Sacré-Cœur because it symbolized the bloody repression of the commune. So I am absolutely sure that she would have hated having a square being named after her there. For the rest, I am in two minds. I do not know what she would have made of having all these institutions named after her. She was an incredibly humble person, which is a bit of a self-staging device. She was quite aware of her persona, if you like. But one thing I think I can say with a fair degree of certainty is that I think she would have really been very proud to have a sports club in London named after her. That's what I would like to conclude with.
Thank you. So I was trying to unmute myself. Thank you so much. That was, again, like really, really fascinating. And thank you for the shout out, for your confidence that she would be really proud of having a sports club named after her. Yeah, great. Thanks so much, both of you. We did have a couple of comments and questions like in the live feed. So I'm just gonna read some of them out, if that's all right. Should I just read them out and then give you both an opportunity to respond? So Neil, first there was a comment saying, thanks Neil, love the combination of Harry Potter and jiu-jitsu. And also there was a question asking how many of these clubs are still going, if there are any still going, and if you can talk a bit more about that. And Constance, there was a couple of questions specifically around Louise Michel. So the first question was why was she such an Anglophile? What attracted her to England, and did she ever break from it? And also, what's her experience with police surveillance in London? Maybe there may be a couple more questions if we have time. So I'll leave it there for now. I'll invite Neil to respond first, and then Constance, if that's all right.
Yeah. Well, the clubs I was describing then, like the Clarion movement pretty much came to an end. There is still to this day a Clarion cycling club. In true form, I believe they had a split a few years ago between a kind of the real Clarion Cycling Club, and they could now call themselves the 1895 Clarion Cycling Club, who want to hold on to the original kind of socialist values of the original Clarion Club. And there was another cycling club that's with the same name that has kind of dropped the politics a bit. So I think that all came to a bit of an end around the time of the Second World War. I think what the other big change was obviously there was a huge kind of workplace sports movement as well. You know, most companies, big companies, had sports teams. You know, my dad worked for Vauxhall and Luton. They used to have these huge sports days and running teams and all kinds of stuff. That also declined along with the industrial trade unions when the industry went down. So I think what you're seeing now is, I think groups like Louise Michel Sports Club, there is a bit of a movement, which I think you can talk about a bit more, is of setting up red gyms and different kinds of new kinds of radical sports clubs that maybe are drawing on some of that history, but in a very different kind of social composition of class.
Great, thank you. Constance, are you happy to respond?
Yes, of course. So I think that the main reason for Anglophilia, I think she really liked the place. Actually, I think she was happy living there, the way she wrote about it, talked about it. I think she liked it. The friendships, the poetry of London, shrouded and everything. And sorry, in the smog. Sorry, that's what she wrote about. And but also really this idea of being free from surveillance. So British surveillance is a very complex question because the official claim was that there was no surveillance of anarchists in Britain, but archives have been destroyed, were destroyed during the Second World War, allegedly. And there's been quite a lot written on that, academic circles. It's a bit of a grey area. So let's say the archival material, the lack thereof, seems to sustain this idea of liberal Britain and no spying of anarchists. So she was spied on by French spies sent by the French police, and there were quite a few. During the peak of the exile years, there would be always a minimum of 2, 3 there perpetually. She was quite elusive. I think that's probably why she started moving out of La Petite France, which was just fully infiltrated with snitches and spies. So I don't think she was spied on by the British police, but yes, by the French one, and they were very assiduous.
Really fascinating, thank you. We had one more question, just quickly about the school, Louise Michel School. Whose children would have like typically gone to that?
Sorry, very good question. I forgot to mention, first of all, on the board. So the board was the who's who of anarchist circles at the time. So Kropotkin, William Morris, Enrico Malatesta, and the teachers were quite sort of prestigious and well known within these anarchist circles. In terms of children, sorry, I should have said this was addressed to the children of exiles primarily. So I think they counted, I can't remember which number of nationalities, but I believe it was more than 10. I think there was a Swedish pupil, for instance, at one stage. And some time ago, about 5 years ago, I was contacted by someone whose mother, she thought, had been to the school. And unfortunately, the person who contacted me passed away before we could meet to discuss it, but she was fairly certain of it. So yes, so exiles from everywhere.
Thank you. Wow, that's amazing. Thank you. So I think it's 1:45 now, so I think maybe we'll wrap up if that's cool. Thank you both so much for coming and talking. It was honestly really fascinating. I'm going to read out, just before we sort of end the call, I'm going to read out the winners of the virtual race. So we did it via like which so like this 5K, 10K, half marathon and full marathon. So the winner of the 5K was our very own Neil, who spoke. So Neil from South London, who did it in 25 minutes and 30 seconds. Well done. 10K was Siobhan from Merseyside, who did it in 44 minutes. The half marathon winner was Callum from South London, who did it in 1 hour and 40 minutes. And the winner of the marathon was Jack from Brighton, who did it in 3 hours and 32 minutes. This is great results. Well done, guys. I actually came last in the 10K, which, you know, I was really happy to compete. So cool. I think we're gonna draw this to an end then. Thank you so much, everyone, again, for coming, and thank you everyone who joined and watched the live stream. So yeah, if you want to know more about Louise Michel Sports Club, just go to www.louisemichel.club and check out us on Twitter and Instagram. Just search us and you'll find us. Yeah, get involved, get active. Thanks everyone. Say good night then, I guess. Good night.